Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. The roundtable discussion on Canada's nuclear policy with Green Party MP Jenica Atwin and special guest Dr. Gordon Edwards and Dr. Susan O'Donnell will now begin. La table ronde sur la politique nucléaire du Canada avec la députée verte Jenica Atwin et les invités spéciaux Dr. Gordon Edwards et Dr. Susan O'Donnell va maintenant commencer. Merci.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rosie. Welcome and good morning. Thank you for everyone who's joining us this morning for this very important conversation. Golizi Gopan, Wolizi Bawel, bienvenue à tous et toutes qui nous joignent ce matin. I'm very pleased to be joined this morning be joining you from my office on the north side of Fredericton, on the unceded territory of the Wollastoq-Gaouyog, La Rivière Belle et Généreux, où je suis honorée de vivre, de travailler, et d'apprendre. I'm really excited about our conversation this morning. This is an opportunity to learn together to discuss the critical issue of nuclear development in Canada. And I've had the immense pleasure of learning so much from Dr. Susan O'Donnell, who happens to be living here in Fredericton as well. And has also been working alongside Dr. Gordon Edwards, who has been working to help clarify fact from fiction when it comes to the Canadian government's approach to nuclear energy. Je suis très enthousiaste à l'idée de notre conversation aujourd'hui pour aider à distinguer la réalité et la fiction en ce qui concerne l'approche du gouvernement canadien en matière d'énergie nucléaire. Dr. O'Donnell is the lead researcher with Raven, a think tank based at the University of New Brunswick, my alma mater, to explore how rural populations engage with the environment. Dr. O'Donnell étudie à l'Université du Nouveau-Brunswick comment des populations rurales s'engagent dans des actions en faveur de l'environnement. Monsieur Edwards est le président du regroupement pour la surveillance du nucléaire. Il apporte des décennies d'expérience à ce sujet et j'ai hâte d'en parler aujourd'hui. Dr. Edwards is the president of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. Together, they bring decades of experience to the topic, and I can't wait to get into our discussion today. And I think what I'll do now is just pass the microphone. We'll start with Susan, to Dr. O'Donnell, to give a brief introduction and provide some context for what we'll be talking about this morning. Thank you, Susan.
Sure. Well, thank you, Jenica, first of all, for the leadership you're demonstrating by hosting this panel. And I hope that other public representatives will follow your lead and bring the public's attention to the fact that the federal government is going all out to promote nuclear reactor development in Canada. You mentioned my project Raven. I should also say that Raven is a member of the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in Canada, and we're advocating for alternatives for clean, renewable technologies for New Brunswick's future. So the government doesn't talk about its ties to the nuclear industry, but in fact, this whole push for proposed nuclear reactors, and it's important that everyone understands this, is coming from an industry that's dying and desperate to survive. And the industry will not talk about how much their plans are going to cost. It's going to cost billions of dollars, and they're going to need most of it or all of it to come from taxpayers. Something that's remarkable is that the government and the nuclear industry speak about these proposed nuclear reactors as if they already exist, but they don't, of course. They're only designs on paper. And in fact, experts have called them PowerPoint reactors. It's going to take decades to build them because the very dangerous radioactive elements that the reactors will produce will remain toxic to all life for hundreds of thousands of years. And the designs that are being proposed are based on older reactors that had considerable safety problems and release of toxic materials into the environment. And that's one of the reasons why we're concerned. You're likely aware that New Brunswick signed an MOU with the provinces of Ontario, Saskatchewan, and more recently Alberta to promote the development of these proposed reactors. And one of the interesting things about this MOU is that it actually binds the parties to only talking about the benefits of these technologies, to only talking about the economic and environmental benefits, and not to talk about the risks. So we're not going to hear any of that from the government. And I think that's really not defensible at all. The government should be forthcoming with information. Another thing that the MOU binds the governments to doing is to promoting nuclear energy as a clean technology that's required as part of the climate change solution, which it's not, of course. Et par conséquent, nos gouvernements encouragent activement ces conceptions de réacteurs nucléaires et ils prétendent que ces réacteurs présentent seulement des avantages économiques et environnementaux. Ils ne mentionnent presque jamais les risques comme les émissions radioactives permanentes et les dangereux déchets nucléaires. Et si vous examinez les informations disponibles auprès des gouvernements fédéraux et provinciaux sur ces projets, vous verrez qu'il s'agit uniquement de matériel promotionnel pour l'industrie nucléaire. Il n'y a pas de véritable analyse économique ou environnementale et surtout pas d'informations sur les risques des projets. Ce n'est que de matériel promotionnel pour l'industrie nucléaire. Et une chose est sûre, c'est que les réacteurs nucléaires proposés ne valent pas la peine d'attendre. That's one thing I want to underline. One thing that's really clear is that the proposed nuclear reactors, they're just not worth the wait. You may know that most technologies dreamed up by engineers never make it to becoming a commercial reality. And I learned that from many years working at the National Research Council of Canada, because as soon as you take a drawing off a computer and put it out into the real world, there are many other aspects that come into play. And I'm all for innovative research, but I've been a researcher now for almost 3 decades. And I know that the first thing you're supposed to do is actually peer review the project. And there's no evidence that these projects have been peer reviewed because the peer review research has determined that the plan to develop SMR technology is far too slow to address the climate crisis compared to investments that can be made today in renewable energy and energy and efficiency. And on top of that, the cost of new nuclear will never be as low as wind and solar. It's just not possible. Alors, l'industrie nucléaire et le gouvernement qu'elle a effectivement capturé font la promotion de nombreuses idées fausses et vous devriez jeter un coup d'œil à leur site web, les affirmations selon lesquelles le nucléaire nous sauveront de la crise climatique. Ce n'est pas vrai. Au contraire, elles retarderont l'action climatique. And so another worrying issue is that after nuclear industry lobbying, the Canadian government in 2019 exempted these projects from a federal environmental impact assessment. So just to finish off my opening, I'd just like to say, my big question is, who the heck is minding the nuclear file, right? We need to get nuclear policy at the federal level and at the provincial level out of the clutches of the nuclear proponents and working for Canadians. Thanks, Jenica.
Oh, thank you so much, Susan. Merci beaucoup. Je prends beaucoup de notes, comme j'ai toujours fait. I'm always taking so many notes because this is so important. And most New Brunswickers, most Canadians don't have any idea about this information. That's why this is so important. And, you know, just referencing back to that MOU about only talking about the benefits, that doesn't do anyone any justice for any subject. We need to balance our conversations always. So that's just a major concern for me. And that's really the reason we're having this conversation today. So just thank you so much for underlying that. I'd love to pass it now to Dr. Gordon Edwards. Just thank you so much for your expertise. And I look forward to, you know, what we've had to join to our conversation today.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Bonjour tout le monde. Mon discours sera en anglais seulement, malheureusement. I'm going to be speaking only in English. An overarching consideration, as already indicated by Susan, is the profound lack of good governance in Canada with regard to nuclear matters. The Liberal Party did not campaign on an ambitious new nuclear expansion program, and technically they have no mandate from the electorate to embark on such a course. The federal government has, to all intents and purposes, seemingly abdicated responsibility to the nuclear industry that has actually dominated Natural Resources Canada for decades, and is virtually, the industry is writing Canada's nuclear policy without any independent democratic mechanisms. There's no parliamentary debate, no public hearings, no objective evaluation and comparison with alternatives, not even, as Susan has mentioned, not even environmental assessments, which have been excluded for these new projects. As a result, Canada is alone in the developed world to be recklessly plowing ahead on so many fronts in the nuclear domain without a shred of public accountability, democratic process, or due diligence. This is certainly not good governance. Canada needs to have, at the very least, in our opinion, number one, an independent regulator that is not tied to the industry or to the ministry that promotes that industry, which is not the case at present. The Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission reports to the very same minister that is promoting the expansion of nuclear projects. In fact, the chairman of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission is now adjudicating a plan to build a new reactor at the Darlington site in Ontario, when she herself previously worked for Ontario Power Generation for 8 years, promoting the building of new reactors at Darlington. Now she is in charge of adjudicating that. What kind of a process is that? Secondly, we need a radioactive waste management and decommissioning agency that is independent from the nuclear industry, the waste producers, and from Enercan that is promoting the industry. Thirdly, we need, what we don't have now, regular reporting to Parliament on at least an annual or semi-annual basis on the status of radioactive waste issues and costs, conducted in an open and transparent public process. And finally, a balanced, deliberative process to advise the government, the Parliament, and Canadians about the advantages and disadvantages of nuclear projects in a multidimensional context, including comparison with alternative, cost implications, toxic legacies, safety concerns, environmental impacts, and international repercussions, for example, proliferation of nuclear weapons. Many people may be unclear about what the word nuclear means. It refers to the nucleus of an atom. Every atom has a tiny nucleus surrounded by orbiting electrons. And in the last century, it was discovered, science discovered, that the most powerful force in the universe is the force that holds the nucleus of an atom together. Consequently, we learned in 1939 that by splitting a uranium atom, you can release enormous energy. If this is done in a bomb, you can destroy a whole city, such as Hiroshima. If it's done in a nuclear reactor, you can use it to boil water. And when you boil water, you get a lot of steam, and that steam can be used to turn a turbine and generate electricity. But that's the good part, because we get the energy, it's very compact, very powerful, and it also doesn't release carbon dioxide because you're not burning anything. So those are good things. But on the downside, we are producing hundreds of radioactive poisons which never existed in nature prior to 1940. And these poisons are indestructible and will last, as Susan has already mentioned, for hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. And we don't know really what to do with them anywhere on Earth as to how to store these things safely for such enormously long periods of time. All of the problems of nuclear power have to do with the radioactive waste. When there's a nuclear accident, what it is simply releasing the inventory of radioactive poisons that are inside every nuclear reactor, no matter whether it's big or small. And consequently, anything, whether it's an explosion, whether it's an accident, whether it's an attack, that releases those radioactive materials can cause enormous damage over a very long period of time. Even now, 45 years after the Chernobyl accident, there's areas of land which are uninhabitable. And the same thing at Fukushima in Japan. And this is what we're facing. We're facing not just an electricity producing machine, but a machine that is also a warehouse of radioactive poisons. And who wants a radioactive poison warehouse on your doorstep? And to call this clean is sort of like Trump saying that he won the election. It's a Trumpism. It's simply a downright lie. And, out of the Hitler playbook, Hitler said that the bigger the lie, the more likely people are to believe it. But there's no way that this is a clean technology. It produces the most dangerous waste of any industry on Earth. Now, they claim it's clean because they managed to contain most of it. Only small amounts of it get out into the environment at the present time, and that's good. They have done a good job at doing that, generally speaking, but they're not going to be around for the next million years. And what happens when you abandon this material, which is what the current plan is? Most Canadians don't even know that there is a current policy review going on as to what to do with all of the different kinds of radioactive waste produced by nuclear power plants, again, of all sizes, no matter if it's small or large. So people aren't even aware of this because it hasn't been advertised. So we are being excluded from decisions which are going to affect our grandchildren's grandchildren. This is not right. Canadians have got to insist that due process must be followed, that transparency and openness is absolutely essential, and democratic process is indispensable. We cannot do without it. And yet the industry has taken over the control of government policy on radioactive waste to such an extent that they get everything they're looking for. They get access to the government, which we don't get. They get the chance to make their case without any other case being made. And the trouble is that the provincial and federal governments simply parrot the industry propaganda. They simply parrot. They're basically acting as salesmen for the nuclear industry rather than as objective adjudicators of the case being presented by the industry and the case that may be presented by the public. So I think that we're off to a good start, and thank you again very much for the Green Party and for you, Jenica, for bringing this to public attention.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I mean, and so much to unpack there. And that's what I'm hoping, anyone watching right now is doing, is really starting to think about this. Even someone who may, see this as a viable option, see this as the direction we need to go, at least ask some of these critical questions. And that's really what I'm hoping is going to come out of this. So, I mean, you both touched on this a little bit in that, looking at what we're discussing in Parliament in particular as well, we've got an environmental accountability bill before us, looking for targets from greenhouse gas emissions reducing, having net zero by 2050. So I think the question, that we want to see answered is really, so is nuclear a valid energy option to combat climate change? That's the biggest issue facing our existence. Is this the silver bullet that's going to help us reach those goals? Is this what we need to be focusing on? So le nucléaire est une option énergique valable pour lutter contre le changement climatique. Ça, c'est la question.
Well, there's, if I may, there's two things that we need to focus on when you're asking that. You're right, Jenica, that is the question of our lifetime. And the two things are rapid reduction of CO2 emissions by 2030. And the second one is net zero by 2050 or much earlier if we can. So as far as 2030 goes, there's absolutely no way that these proposed reactors, they probably won't even be off the drawing board, let alone built by 2030. So no, they can't help us when we need them the most. There's absolutely no way. And even the government admits that. And so strike one. The next thing is, can they help us by 2050? Well, if they're actually built and if they actually work, which is a big question, they potentially could. However, it's all going to come down to the cost. And as I mentioned, nuclear is by far the most expensive energy right now. New nuclear is just way out of whack compared to, say, industrial solar or wind. And so why would service providers, why would utilities choose nuclear unless they're forced to, for example? Because we have to do it in a way that's affordable and protects the environment. And that doesn't even count the cost of the nuclear waste that we're generating, as Gordon mentioned. So Gordon, I know this is something you talk about a lot. Do you have any other comments about how nuclear can or cannot deal with climate change?
Yes, well, I think you've hit it pretty well on the head. It's too slow and too expensive, and it's also too unproven. For example, if we just look at one of the many reactors that are being proposed, there's so many different models being proposed that it's ridiculous. It reminds me of Stephen Leacock, who said that a man flung himself on his horse and rode off madly in all directions. Well, you just can't run off in all directions at once. And the Canadian government, in promoting small modular reactors, they're not just choosing one small modular reactor to develop. They're choosing 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 different models, all using different technologies, and all models which have been tried in other countries such as France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the USA, and have failed. They have failed to commercialize. For example, the ARC 100 reactor proposed for New Brunswick is a so-called liquid sodium fast reactor. Well, they tried to build one in the United States, commercial size, and it had a meltdown. They tried to build one in France. It was called the Super Phoenix, and they abandoned it because it just became too problematic. They tried it in Germany. They tried it in UK. So these things are far from proven. Moreover, all the projections, as Susan mentioned earlier, the role of nuclear in global electricity has declined steadily from 17% in 1997 down to 10% today. And even the US Energy Administration is predicting that it's going to go to 5% in the foreseeable future. So we're talking about an industry which is on the decline. Even nuclear enthusiasts are admitting that there will be no large nuclear power plants built in North America ever again. And so the reason they're going for these small modular reactors is because they're desperate. And the desperation shows in the proliferation of ideas. Let's not just have one idea, let's have 20, 30, 40 different ideas. So I don't think that this is the way to go. Meanwhile, wind and solar and other renewables such as heat pumps are achieving fantastic strides. They're growing much, much faster than any other form of energy, far exceeding all other forms of energy combined. So I think that we have to go, if your house is on fire, the first thing to do is pour water on it, not to set up a think tank to develop a scheme for 10 years from now. You got to put the fire out now. And this is an emergency. What does an emergency mean? It means it's got to be reacted to immediately. We can't wait 10, 15, 20 years on the outside chance that one of these models is going to pay off, especially when other countries have tried it and failed.
Oh, thank you so much for those answers. And, it makes me think about the investments from our provincial government. We just saw 20 million, given to a company for conducting the research. And I'm thinking where that money could have gone, especially during a pandemic, part of this recovery that we're looking into, and, what energy retrofits could do, what, investing in solar and geothermal and in tidal, in wind turbines. It's just, we're right there. And then to see we kind of this
Right.
stark departure from what I thought was heading down into the right direction. It's upsetting. And I want to be open-minded. I have been open-minded. I've had many conversations, even with those who are, proponents of nuclear, discussing different types of reactors, what could be safer. I did a lot of exploring into thorium-based reactors, but this is not really what we're talking about here. So it's the reality of what we're being presented. And one of the things that is really being kind of pitched as this positive concept is that at least some of the small modular nuclear reactor models are hoping to repurpose spent fuel. So the government calls this recycling spent fuel. Is this an option to actually use up dangerous nuclear waste? So is this kind of the solution for our past problems? I'll just repeat it in French quickly before I turn it over. So au moins certains des modèles des petits réacteurs nucléaires modulaires espérant réutiliser le combustible usé. Le gouvernement appelle cela le recyclage de combustible usé. S'agit-il d'une option permettant d'utiliser réellement les dangereux déchets nucléaires? Susan or Gordon, to whoever wants to.
I'll try it first.
Okay.
C'est un autre exemple de cacher la réalité. It's really unreal how they're using this term called recycling when really there's two things. What they're doing is extracting the plutonium from the used nuclear fuel, but only extracting less than 1% of what's in the waste. And yet they're putting this, feel-good recycling label on it, when in fact it's probably the dirtiest and most dangerous process in the whole nuclear possibilities of nuclear industry. And when you look at the most radioactively polluted areas on the planet, they're the result of these experiments to try and do something similar with used nuclear fuel. But Gordon knows a lot more about it than I do, so I'll turn it over to him.
Yeah, Susan is right. It's when the first reactors were built, they were all built to produce plutonium for bombs. That was the purpose of the original reactors. They were not built to produce electricity. But in the process of producing plutonium and extracting plutonium, it's a very old technology. It's what the military used. And in India, we gave them a nuclear reactor as a gift from Canada, and they used the plutonium produced in that reactor to build their first atomic bomb. So by spreading the technology for producing and extracting plutonium in particular, you're spreading the bomb. You're really spreading the bomb materials that are needed for nuclear weapons. And plutonium is the primary nuclear explosive in all nuclear weapons. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter, who was the only political leader who was trained as a nuclear engineer, and who actually came to Canada to clean up after a nuclear meltdown in 1952 at Chalk River, he banned plutonium extraction from the United States. He said that it's far too dangerous on proliferation grounds, and he tried his very best to get this ban extended worldwide because it's kind of opening Pandora's box. And the idea that you can use plutonium for energy, which is true. You can use plutonium for energy to burn as fuel in a nuclear reactor. Burn I use as a euphemism. It really means fission, to split the atoms. But when you split the plutonium atoms, you create even more radioactive waste, even more long-term radioactive waste. The radioactive materials that last for millions of years are produced in greater quantity when you split not only the uranium atoms, but also the plutonium atoms. But the most serious objection to that proposal is that since they're talking about exporting these reactors around the world, the whole justification is you mass produce these things and you sell them everywhere. Well, that means everywhere in the world, you're going to have plutonium stockpiles being created. Plutonium is not found in nature at all. We create it. The only place you find plutonium is where man and people have made it. So this is our problem, is that we're actually spreading these technologies means that we are planting the seeds of our own destruction, because the proliferation of nuclear weapons is the second most serious threat to the survival of humanity and to survival of nature. After climate change, the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the threat of all-out nuclear war is an existential crisis as well. So we can't go down that path without putting our entire planet at peril.
I'd just like to say, Jenica, I'm really glad you raised this question, because this is a live issue in New Brunswick. It's not just a theoretical. The most recent gift from the federal government to a nuclear company, Moltex, is exactly to develop this technology to extract plutonium from the used waste at the LaPro facility, which is right on the Bay of Fundy, which is one of the natural wonders of our planet. And so we have grave concerns about it. And that's why, one of the reasons why we're so interested in following this issue so closely.
And it's another example of a vacuum, a policy vacuum. We have no policy in Canada about reprocessing. That is, reprocessing is a euphemism for plutonium extraction. And why is plutonium extraction the important thing? Well, the reason why is because the spent nuclear fuel, that is, when you take the fuel that comes out of a nuclear reactor, small or large, it's so radioactive that it will kill any human being in less than 20 seconds at a distance of 1 meter. So that means that you have what's called, what we describe as a radioactive firewall that prevents you. You can't just tuck a fuel bundle under your arm and run away with it. You're going to be dead before you take 10 steps. So that's why separating the plutonium makes it much easier to access, much easier to transport. Plutonium itself gives off very little penetrating radiation. It's much easier to smuggle across borders. It's much easier to hide, and it's much easier to make into, and of course, it is the only thing that you can really use from the spent fuel to make into an atomic bomb.
Oh, wow. I just wanted to mention there's a comment, a question came in, and it's very timely to what we're discussing right now. So it's from Carl Mercier. I work on UN disarmament mediation through Mediators Beyond Borders International. Timely topic given the environment and security risks of nuclear arms and energy. And that's certainly, even if we're discussing, the science behind it and whether or not it can, help us in the fight against climate change, and is it an option for our energy needs? That's a question that also needs to be addressed, is how will this be used, specifically if we are exporting it? And I have serious concerns, especially with the lack of policy in Canada today. And Gordon, you mentioned too, the lack of debate as well. I'd like to take this opportunity to say that I would like to put forward that, that we request an emergency debate in the House of Commons on this issue. As I said, it's kind of spinning. It's like we're heading on a one-way track right now, and we need to slow down and make sure that Canadians are able to weigh in and that members of Parliament are able to weigh in.
This is exactly, Jenica, I'm so pleased to hear you say that, and to get that question from somebody who's actually working on these kinds of issues, because this is exactly what needs to happen. These issues are much, much broader than just, a funding announcement from one government industry to some small company in St. John. These raise international concerns. It puts Canada in a whole different category politically, on the global world order. And so it should be debated in Parliament. It must be debated, mostly because, as you mentioned, the parliamentarians are completely unaware that this has been going on. And that's that's being done absolutely deliberately. The reason no one is talking about it. Gordon, it looks like I know this is something you've been advocating for a long time, parliamentary debate on this topic.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I sent an open letter to Pierre Elliott Trudeau when he was Prime Minister way back in 1977, challenging him to initiate a public debate on both the advantages and disadvantages of nuclear, so that the whole of society, including decision makers, parliamentarians, can have access to the best information on both sides of the coin. The information from the industry, which is valuable and which is valid insofar as it goes, but also the information from people who are not promoting nuclear, but who are critical of the dangers that it poses as well. Just to give you an example, there was a nuclear physicist called Sir Brian Flowers, who wrote a report from the UK called the Flowers Report. It was a UK environmental assessment report on nuclear energy and the environment. And he pointed out that if nuclear power had been developed before World War II and deployed throughout Europe, then large parts of Europe would be uninhabitable today because of World War II. Because an ordinary conventional bomb or sabotage on a nuclear reactor can release those radioactive poisons. It doesn't have to be an accident. And for those who say that nuclear power is clean, ask them the following question. What's the worst that can happen if you drop a blockbuster bomb on a wind farm or solar energy installation, compared with what happens if you drop it on a nuclear reactor? And the difference is dramatic and very, very clear. That to call nuclear clean is simply to engage in a big lie.
I think, and absolutely, I'm scared to be honest. This is where this is heading. But we can be active. The agency of our citizens is what needs to be emphasized here as well. So anyone watching, we're going to discuss in a little bit as well. But what you can do, how you can voice your concerns, write letters. We'll get to that as well. But it's something that's really on my mind as this conversation develops, especially considering some of the recent news out of New Brunswick, as with relationships with Indigenous and non-Indigenous, peoples in our country and in our province. So I'm thinking about the idea of consent, about free, prior, and informed consent to what happens in traditional and existing territories for Indigenous peoples, and the ability to have your say about something that's going to impact generations down the line. I think about my Indigenous children. I think about non-Indigenous children as well. And I was part of a group. It was the TRC recommendations in New Brunswick, and it was meant to bring together all parties and chiefs, elected officials, to have open conversations and dialogue. And things kind of fell apart when this announcement was made to give 20 million for this kind of research without consulting Indigenous peoples. So we've got the Willistic Grand Council. They made it very clear that they have not been consulted about nuclear development on their unceded territory and that it's not welcome. The Chiefs of Ontario passed a resolution rejecting further nuclear development. The Assembly of First Nations has passed a resolution calling to halt public funding for nuclear reactors. So why do you think, what is driving this consensus from Indigenous nations and representatives across the country? I'll just, again, repeat it in French before we move on. Le Grand Conseil de Willistic a fait savoir très clairement qu'il n'a pas été consulté au sujet du développement nucléaire sur le territoire non cédé et qu'il n'est pas le bienvenu. Les chefs d'Ontario ont adopté une résolution rejetant la poursuite du développement nucléaire. L'Assemblée des Premières Nations a adopté une résolution demandant l'arrêt du financement public des réacteurs nucléaires. À votre avis, qu'est-ce qui explique ce consensus des nations et des représentants autochtones à travers le pays?
I'll start that one. It's a great question, Jenica, and so important. I would say, first of all, that most non-Indigenous people have been bamboozled by promotion by the nuclear industry over decades. And especially as we've been talking, that only talking about the great aspects of nuclear. Whereas it seems that just from my readings and my conversations with Indigenous people and my understanding, to the extent that I have it, of Indigenous knowledge, the focus is on life and life for 7 generations and many more generations down the road, so that when decisions are taken, that they're always future thinking and always thinking about the health of the planet, because Indigenous people, more than any other groups of people, understand that it's the planet that sustains us and that we have to keep it healthy. And so that's always at the center of decisions that are made, and the future thinking. And so the fact that nuclear waste is out there and is dangerous to all life for hundreds of thousands of years is of great concern, and a very much so a uniting factor for Indigenous peoples. And Gordon, I know that you work with several Indigenous groups on these issues.
Yes, the Anishinaabe Nation and the Iroquois Caucus in Ontario formed an alliance on the radioactive waste question, and they've created a radioactive waste task force. They issued a joint declaration, I was just finding it here on my other screen, in which they enunciate certain principles. But the reason why First Nations people and Indigenous people are so concerned about this is because they have a great respect for Mother Earth and for the waters. The waters of the earth are like the lifeblood of the planet. And if you pollute the waters, you really have the potential to impact all of life. And these radioactive materials, they're like little time bombs. They're unstable atoms, so that they will explode suddenly and violently. And if they get into fish or wildlife or humans, they can damage the cells in such a way that you have all kinds of diseases, cancers, damage to the reproductive cells, which affect future generations. Also compromising the immune system, making you more vulnerable to. So that's why we have to keep these things out of the environment, because we know that they have bad effects. Now, the First Nations people and the Indigenous people have been targeted for receiving a lot of these wastes. They say, we produce the waste, we've done our share, now it's your job to take the wastes and live with them on your land. Well, they say, what kind of a deal is that? So they're being targeted. They're definitely, and they have already been targeted in the past. In fact, most of the uranium mining around the world has taken place on Indigenous lands or very close to Indigenous lands, leaving here in Canada, we have 200 million tons of radioactive waste left over from uranium mining. And that's mostly in Indigenous territories. So the Indigenous people, the Native people, whatever you call them, they are well aware of the fact that the settlers, as they call us, as we are, that we are creating problems, not just for our generation, but for countless generations to come, and that we should stop doing it. And, the interesting thing is that whenever they're consulted about what should we do with these wastes, their number one point is, well, first of all, stop making it. And of course, you build more reactors, you create more waste. So we're going in exactly the wrong direction. And this joint declaration has 5 points, principles that the Canadian government would be well advised to accept as principles for Canadian waste management. Number one is these wastes should not be abandoned. They're too dangerous to abandon. We should be keeping an eye on them. We should be monitoring them and making them retrievable. Secondly, they should be packaged and labeled so that future generations know what they have to deal with, and they can also repackage it when necessary and make improvements in the packaging as time goes on. Number three, it should be monitored and retrievable. Number four, very important, it should be away from any major water bodies. You notice that these reactors are always on important water bodies, like Point Lepreau is right on the Bay of Fundy. And that's where these small modular reactors are going to be in New Brunswick too. What could be more important than protecting the Bay of Fundy or protecting the Great Lakes in the case of Ontario reactors? In Quebec, we have a reactor, which fortunately we've now shut down, which is right on the St. Lawrence River. So it's all these major water bodies that's not where the waste should be going. And finally, no imports or exports or transports even without real consultation with the people who are going to be affected by any possible accidents along the route. So the First Nation people are really thinking about this, and they're really coming up with genuine principles that should be adopted. The government is not thinking about it. They're letting the industry do all the thinking for them.
Thank you so much. And I think, I speak with my my stepfather very often. He's a Williston Grand Chief of this territory and a language keeper. And I asked him, is there a word for nuclear? And the grandmothers and elders came up with the term, and it's Asgomis Senegat, which means forever dangerous, or toujours dangereux. And I think that, it's very telling, that conversation, and the keepers of the land and the people who should be, consulting with on these issues, to have been left out. And that's the perception, forever dangerous. So, I mean, we do need to start wrapping up and rolling into our final comments here. And there's so much to think about today. As I said, I've taken more notes again, and I will speak with my colleagues and request an emergency debate in the House, and we'll see if the Speaker, grants us that wish, because I think it's critical that across Canada, members of Parliament representing every riding in this country weigh in on such a huge decision. This is the direction we're choosing to take right now, in a moment of climate crisis, in a moment of pandemic recovery. And so, I mean, there's lots of questions that were coming in about, well, what's the viability? How do we get off of coal, gas, oil, our dependency, and all those practical concerns if we don't go with nuclear. But I suppose my final opinion would be that there's lots of other options, So I think I'll leave it with Gordon and Susan, just to give kind of your final closing statements before we have to wrap up.
Well, I'll just speak to anyone across Canada, but especially in New Brunswick, that we do have a coalition that is working actively to raise these questions and inform the public, and we're doing our best. I would call on, and Gordon and I have actually met with the Minister of Energy, Mike Holland, here, and we've asked, will you please share information about the risks with New Brunswickers? We need to ask the same of the federal government. Please do not just promote nuclear industry material on your websites, in your addresses, etc. Share information about the risks about radioactive waste. And I would ask anyone who's concerned about this to consult their local groups who are working actively on this, and to get active, and to talk to your political representatives about it. Gordon?
Yes, well, years ago, as I mentioned earlier, we appealed to the government of Canada. This is under Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, that we should really be having a national debate on this, where all the issues are put on the table and discussed in a factual manner, in an objective manner, because this leads to good decision making. This allows parliamentarians and even the cabinet members to actually learn something about not only not to get just inebriated with the industry sales pitch, which, by the way, can be very inebriating. I mean, if all you hear are the good things about nuclear, you think it's wonderful. When I was in high school, I was in favor of nuclear. I even wanted to go into the nuclear field because all I knew about it was safe, clean, cheap, and abundant. And it was only after I graduated and went into graduate school that I discovered that none of these adjectives are correct. They're mislabels. And if that's what you think it is, then of course you're going to be in favor of it. But you have to learn that those are weasel words. They're not really accurately describing the situation. Yes, there's an element of truth in them, but there's a whole there's a whole ton of truth on the other side that needs to be weighed in the balance. So that's what we need to have here in Canada. We need to have responsible decision-making based on transparency, openness, consultation, and debate.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much. Et merci tout le monde pour nous joindre aujourd'hui. So we're going to be closing off on Facebook Live, but we'll be able to take questions from media after this as well. But this is just so important. As I said, I hope more people are going back to their living rooms, to their workplaces, having conversations. This is a critical moment. As I said, this is just deciding on the direction we're going to take. So there could be no bigger question, I think, right now. It relates to our relationship with Indigenous peoples. It relates to how we're fighting for our environment. So this is the biggest question, I think, of our time. So it's been an honor, and I'm so thankful that we've had this conversation, and I'll certainly be looking to both of you for follow-ups and to answer more questions that I have, because I'm not an expert. As a sitting member of Parliament, many will not be, and that's not the idea. The idea is to have a fulsome, open, transparent discussion with fact, and to challenge, as you said, the inebriated, he could be inebriated, on the lobbyists. We know they're powerful. So this is an important question for any subject. We need to look at it in those critical terms. So thank you again. Merci tout le monde. And I'm so appreciative.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Atwin. Thank you, Dr. O'Donnell and Dr. Edwards. This concludes today's roundtable. Thank you everyone for joining us. Merci à Madame Atwin, Dr. O'Donnell et Dr. Edwards. Ceci conclut la table ronde d'aujourd'hui. Merci à tout le monde pour nous rejoindre.
Bye, thank you.